Mr. Rewane is the CEO at Financial Derivatives Company and Channels Television Economic Counselor, and is live to us from the Nigerian Stock Exchange, where our studio is in downtown Lagos. Mr. Rewane, good morning. It's good to have you here. Quite a lot in our news box this morning, and starting with the news that there's been a total system collapse of the TCN, Transmission Company of Nigeria, National Grid, early today, as confirmed by Eco Electricity Distribution Company. What does this tell you about the current state of the power sector and the road we still need to travel to get to sustainable power supply?
The power sector is actually what we can call a saga. Basically, it's either one thing or the other, either a generation collapse, pipeline disruption, transmission collapse, or disco at the retail level. What we can say is that the Nigerian consumer of electricity is having a raw deal. So it's time to actually revisit the entire sector and deal with the problems frontally. So it's a disaster, and it has a knock-on effect on inflation and output. Yeah.
If we're going to revisit it, what would you advise the current administration to do, which they've been skirting around for the last year, say we're going to revisit it, and most likely during this Buhari's second term in office? What would be your prognosis?
First and foremost, there's no quick fix to power. The thing is that you've got to deal with the cost-reflective tariffs on one hand. You've got to encourage investment into the sector. You've got to give forbearance for the debt. And when I say forbearance of the debt, convert the debt which is outstanding into equity and sell the equity at a discount. You know, just like you're trying to do with the contractor debt. We have 2.3 trillion naira of contractor debt that is being securitized with a haircut of about almost 25 to 30%. So if you did the same and sold the converted debt into equity at a discount, the country can raise a significant amount of money. But what that will do is to allow new investments into the sector, and then you can begin to move your generated output without constraints to something above 5,000, 6,000, 7,000. With that, you can actually reduce the downtime. But what's happening here is, one, temperatures are high, humidity is high, people are using the air conditioners, and there are some other constraints. The gas constraint in Egbin and the things that are happening on the pipeline are actually affecting output. And once output is affected, you can imagine that it will have an impact on prices. We were talking about inflation earlier on. Your inflation story will be short-lived as long as power supply is constrained.
There's this cankerworm called petrol subsidy. How do we get it out?
Well, subsidies are not just petrol subsidies, just one of many subsidies in the economy. But subsidies usually are targeted at production, not consumption. So you've got to make up your mind. I think it's such a hot potato and nobody wants to talk about it. It's on everybody's mind, but on nobody's lips. The reality is that you need equilibrium pricing for products. Once we have the template transparently shown to the people, that is the price of oil, the exchange rate, the logistics cost, and all of this put there. When the price of oil drops, the retail price of petrol will actually decline. When it increases, it will go up. Nigerians are not averse to paying for the correct price for petrol as long as they're getting the correct price. But there are three things happening. One, the subsidy regime is being abused. Secondly, it's inflated, because I do not believe that Nigeria is consuming 50 million liters of PMS every day. And thirdly, the most important piece of evidence is that hardly anywhere in the world would you see the price of petrol being lower than the price of diesel. Diesel is at the bottom of the fractional distillation column of refineries, and therefore it is infinitely cheaper. It should be infinitely cheaper than petrol. Diesel is selling today retail at 230, wholesale at about 210, while PMS is selling at 145. Obviously, there's something wrong. So one, we should establish how much we really import. Two, is there a subsidy? And if there is a subsidy, how is it being administered? And thirdly, it should not be abused. It is open to a lot of abuse because the people benefiting from the subsidy scam are fewer, but they're feeding fat on it, and the people are suffering.
The finance minister, Mr. Rewane, the finance minister says yes, Nigeria will take the advice of the IMF chief, Christine Lagarde, but there are no buffers yet, or what you call the cushioning effect for Nigeria to execute a fuel subsidy removal. What do you think these buffers are or should be, and how do you think we should execute it and how soon?
The theory is simple that petrol is the fuel for transportation. And therefore, if once you increase the price of petrol, or the price of petrol was to increase, it will have a knock-on effect on inflation generally, and actually that becomes a major problem for people who have had no minimum wage review for a while, and that where labor productivity is negative, so it has all sorts of negative connotations. But you have to ask yourself, do you want to be in a perpetual state? This is a rhetoric, and this is a ritual that from 1985 to date, the IMF will say reduce subsidy. Nigeria will say we don't have the buffers, and we've been doing this for 30, 40 years. The buffers will never be there, or will never be adequate or sufficient. You've got to decide, do you want to have equilibrium pricing for a product? And if you have equilibrium pricing for a product, then you manage it efficiently. Because like I said, there's gross abuse of the subsidy system. If the abuse is removed, maybe the amount of subsidy in question is limited, and then we begin to manage it more efficiently. So one, get rid of the abuse. Two, make it more efficient. And thirdly, be determined to put a timeline in which you will have equilibrium pricing. Because with disequilibrated pricing, subsidies are reverse taxes. What you are doing, you are depriving people of education, depriving people of health, depriving people of power, and so many things. So quite frankly, we need to get rid of this because diesel is deregulated, kerosene is deregulated, dual-purpose kerosene is deregulated, lubricants are deregulated. Every other thing in the downstream sector is deregulated. And so we've got to accept the fact that at one point in time we have to deregulate it. Maybe when the buffers are there, but if we are going to wait for buffers, we must have a time in which the buffers have to be established before, so that we know when we can exit this thing. But sooner or later, this country will have to come to terms with the fact that these fiscal adjustments are necessary if we are going to address the problem of growth. Without growth, even if you have revenue without growth is only you're only delaying the chaos that comes in such a situation.
Yes, you're just touching on what my thoughts are for the next question about other advice on structural economic reforms that the IMF pointed out in the Article 4 consultation, then a few other of such advice that came through the just concluded World Bank IMF spring meetings. So how do you think we put this power and petrol in the entire mix of whether it's the ERGP, whatever it is we're doing over the next 4 years, taking us beyond the year 2020? So what do you think, how do you think we'll be able to put these two very critical factors of industrialization and progress within the mix of the growth that we're talking about? Look at our projections so far for 2019 and 2020, and look at what the IMF and the World Banks are throwing at us, much lower than the official figures.
No, first and foremost, the IMF and the World Bank, which we call the Washington Consensus, are the GPs of economics. That is, they are the general practitioners. That is, they are the doctors. You know, like going to the general hospital. There are specialized institutions that also help in this, and I include the ADB as part of that. They're telling you what you should know and what you need to do rather than what you want to do. So you take that into consideration, but you do what you have to do to actually achieve accelerated growth and lack of distortions in your economy. That the fact that you don't need a doctor to tell you to stop smoking. The thing is that the IMF is telling you precisely what you already know. So making a reference to the IMF or the World Bank is actually, it's rhetoric. The truth is that there are certain things that we need to do. We have the ERGP. Of course, we have other things that we have to do. Those adjustments are clearly within the purview of government. The federal government has 52% of 52.5% of federal government of federation account revenues. The states constitute another, and the local governments constitute another 48%. So when you're looking at the Nigerian economy, you look at it both in the context of the federal government, context of the states, and the context of the private sector. We need growth, we need investments. And to have investments, you need to take away distortions in pricing of factors and prices commodities. So that is why the IMF, rightly so, the international community through Paris Club and London Club are telling you, do these things, because in the end, you will be borrowing money for consumption, and your debt service will become choking to your growth. So the thing to do is to unlock revenue sources, ensure that investments come in, because people will only invest if they know they can determine the price at which they will sell the product, and when they will have a decent return, and come up with a mixed market-driven economy rather than a controlled economy on one hand, and on the other hand, you have a market economy. You need to have a mixed economic model targeted at growth, which will improve the quality of lives of Nigerians, because right now we are growing at 2%, maybe with some luck 2.1%. That is suboptimal. We need to grow GDP at 4% to cover population growth, 6% to cover employment, and 8% to transform the lives of Nigerians. We need to increase total investment in the economy from $66 billion to something like $140 to $150 billion. We need to grow consumption, and we have to do all of these things simultaneously. What does the future hold? The future looks good, but we have to make those decisions. The future depends on decisions we make today. You can't dither, you can't kick the can down the road. You've got to make some hard choices. You cannot spend money that you have not earned. You cannot borrow your way out of this situation. You've got to borrow, you've got to invest, but more than anything else, you have to improve output by productivity gains. So that's it. You talked about power supply, the grid breakdown. You talked about the good news on inflation, but that news will be short-lived, because we are going into a season of planting. We are also going into the season in which even the power supply will constrain output. So everything is set. We've got to approve the 2019 budget immediately and get back to work. Elections are over. It's time to do the hard work and the heavy lifting. The president should be on top of this, and I think he's on top of it. Thank you very much.
Mr. Rewane, you talked about, you hinted about quality of life, but also safety of life as well. Do you think we're taking the economic implications of the killing fields across the country into consideration? If you look at the spate of killings almost on a daily basis, lives have been lost in a number of states across the country by bandits and those who are called herdsmen or whatever they're called, and militia, whatever it is across the country. Do you think we're taking real cognizance of the economic effect or impact of our economic future, putting this spate of killings across the country in the entire economic calculation of where we're going from here?
No, I mean, the consequences of doing nothing, or the consequences of allowing a drift in economic direction, will lead to what you can call economic and social anarchy. What you are seeing, you are pointing out to the symptoms of anarchy, which is a result of an economic drift. So you've got to arrest the drift, which is causing this problem, while at the same time dealing with the intelligence and the security issues. These people, because they are economically insecure, are taking the law into their hands. And because the law enforcement agents are also ill-equipped, so you are seeing it becomes a vicious cycle of what we call the dark sides of democracy, where you allow, there's anarchy and rule of law has broken down. The president's three-point agenda about dealing with security, the economy, and corruption, all of those things are necessary conditions, but they are not enough. The sufficient conditions are to achieve growth, and that this growth should be equitably distributed. Because right now you are having growth, which is suboptimal. You're having inequitable distribution of income. Your Gini coefficient, which measures the difference between the poor and the rich, is at 43. It's going towards 44, 45, which means that the difference between the poor and the very poor is getting wider. I don't want to use the word between the rich and the poor, because the rich in Nigeria are just a handful. Probably can put them in one bus, right? When I say the very rich, all right? The bulk of the people, the middle class, have been wiped out. So you are now dealing with the poor and the very poor. And if you're not careful, you have an animal farm situation where people will cannibalizing themselves. And so dealing with the economic growth, dealing with the distribution of income and distribution of opportunities is one thing. Then at the same time, simultaneously, you take the law and order thing into consideration and begin to clamp down on these guys who are taking advantage of their, the economic anarchy and superimposing political and law of the jungle. So that's what you have right now.
So what's your outlook, Mr. Rewane, on inflation? As we wrap up this conversation, what's your outlook? The MPC says there will be inflation uptick from between May and August this year. What are the consequences down the road?
I think you are going to have, you see, what we've done in Nigeria, we have focused too much on historical inflation. If you look at the month-on-month inflation, that was the only variable that increased. One. So the month-on-month inflation is much more current, which shows that between the months of February and the month of March, we saw an increase on prices rather than comparing the prices now with a year ago. So that's a pointer to the fact that inflation is about to start picking up. But it is still at 11.25%. However, we have the minimum wage effect, both at the private, public sector and the states. But inflation, even after factoring all of these adjustments, inflation will still be within what we can call the natural rate of inflation. Don't forget that Nigeria and Angola are the only two African countries that witnessed a decline in inflation this month. All the others witnessed an increase, and I think Uganda was flat. So in reality, we've done a good job more or less in containing inflation because we've controlled money supply. The price of diesel has been flat, but I think all of these things are artificial. The reality is that as we move into April and May, the planting season will start, the minimum wage effect will kick in, and then more important, the securitization of contractor debt, 2.3 trillion naira, which is about 10% of money supply, is going to be securitized. People are going to discount this. They're going to take the cash and go to the bank, use the cash to open LCs, to buy Forex and all that. So you're going to see pressure coming from all sides. Hopefully by May, June, after the government kicks in, there will be a supplementary budget. So my outlook for the next quarter is that there's a lot of work to be done, but then you will see the good side. We will see increased investment, increased activity, and the government has to be ready to actually, because in a second term, you don't have a honeymoon. We've got to hit the road running from this moment. So boasting the picture is not bad, but there's a lot of work to be done. Let's not deceive ourselves. We are cautiously optimistic about the immediate future.
Is there anything the current administration is doing that encourages you about your outlook for the future, Mr. Rewane?
I'm happy about one thing. One, they have renewed all the oil blocks without any intervention. All the oil blocks have been renewed. Secondly, the NNPC has come out to say they will repay the arrears of $3.5 billion owed to the oil companies. So once we now begin to see investment in the oil sector and the price of oil at $70 a barrel, if we use those resources efficiently and take some hard decisions about some adjustments that have to be made, then I'm optimistic. I've seen the numbers when we're working on the minimum wage thing, and there's work to be done, and I think the administration is determined to do that work. Failure to do anything will be a recipe for the undesirable. But I'm confident that they will have to do the right thing, because I don't want to consider what will happen if nothing is done.
Well, thank you very much for your time with us on the program today. Mr. Rewane, CEO at Financial Derivatives Company and Channels Television Economic Counselor. Do have a great day. Thank you very much for coming. Let's take a break, everyone. We'll be back in 2.